Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Insight Global for more powerful insights into the shifting global order. The pace of global change has accelerated to levels unseen in recent history. What once began as a bold and aggressive U.S. initiative, the so-called tariff war against China and much of the world, has now reached its most dramatic turning point. Years of fiery rhetoric, televised promises, and forceful declarations from Washington are now ending not in triumph, but in concession and damage control. The tariff war was once marketed as a strategy to force American dominance on global markets. The White House promised to bring industries home, restore jobs, and compel nations to depend on U.S. goods and services. Yet after years of confrontation, the outcome is entirely different. Washington is preparing to quietly dismantle the very tariffs it imposed, acknowledging not only their futility but also the staggering costs to the American economy and its global reputation. According to insiders close to the administration, lists are already being drafted that include sweeping reductions on tariffs, covering not only Chinese products but also imports from India, Brazil, and several major Asian economies. This represents not a shift in strategy, but a retreat. Even members of Congress are speaking with unusual bluntness. America has counted its losses, and the numbers are devastating. Instead of the promised industrial renaissance, the country faces unprecedented inflation, fractured supply lines, and a dangerous erosion of trust among its closest allies. The damage has been global in scale. India, once courted heavily by Washington and promised special treatment, has shifted decisively toward Beijing, signing dozens of agreements in high technology, energy, and defense. Brazil has realigned its exports to the BRICS bloc, openly admitting that cooperation with China offers greater stability and profitability. Even Europe, a long-standing partner of the United States, has grown weary of American unpredictability and has begun reorganizing its industries to reduce dependence on Washington. In effect, the U.S. finds itself isolated. Where it once dictated the rules of global commerce, it now watches from the sidelines as new economic frameworks take shape, frameworks increasingly built around China, Russia, and the wider BRICS community. Analysts at the Peterson Institute emphasize the irony. The tariff war, intended to weaken China, instead accelerated its rise. Beijing used the pressure as an opportunity to double its investments abroad, strengthening ties across Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. By diversifying its markets and developing domestic industries, China reduced its vulnerability to U.S. consumers. Inside classified White House reports, the admission is clear. The tariff war left China stronger than it was before. A failure of this scale, many analysts argue, represents the greatest U.S. strategic blunder in decades. At home, the consequences have been catastrophic. Farmers in Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and beyond became the first victims of retaliation. When Beijing cut off purchases of American soybeans and grain, tens of thousands of farms faced bankruptcy. Federal compensation programs were inadequate, leaving many families with no option but to shut down businesses built over generations. The manufacturing sector, supposedly the heart of the America First agenda, also suffered deeply. Despite promises of jobs returning and factories reopening, the opposite occurred. Companies moved production to Mexico, Vietnam, and even Africa to bypass tariffs. Large corporations exploited loopholes, rerouting goods through third countries, rendering tariffs ineffective while simultaneously raising costs for U.S. consumers. Instead of strengthening industry, tariffs eroded competitiveness and fueled inflation. Economic studies make the picture clearer and grimmer. The Penn-Wharton budget model estimates long-term U.S. GDP could shrink by up to 6% while wages may decline by 5%. Data from Yale's Budget Lab suggests that by the end of 2025, employment levels will remain nearly 500,000 jobs below previous projections. For a nation where job creation was the foundation of the political campaign, the slogan, "Bringing jobs back," has now become an emblem of broken promises and disappointment. The political repercussions are severe. Within the Republican Party, a widening rift is evident. Hardliners demand even tougher measures, seeking new levers of pressure. Yet more pragmatic voices admit the reality: America has driven itself into a dead end. Economists are blunt. The U.S. has embarked on a path of self-destruction, undermining its own industries and credibility abroad. Allies, once reliant on Washington, increasingly turn toward Beijing as the steadier partner. Developing nations, meanwhile, view the United States not as a stabilizing leader but as a source of chaos and uncertainty. China, on the other hand, has capitalized on every American miscalculation. It has deepened military cooperation with Russia, expanded Belt and Road infrastructure projects across Eurasia and Africa, and invested heavily in Middle Eastern economies. By building alternative trade corridors and strengthening partnerships, Beijing has presented much of the world with a compelling choice: a stable, long-term framework in contrast to Washington's erratic and short-sighted policies. The American press, once cautiously optimistic, is now openly critical. The New York Times has called this period a "lost decade" for U.S. economic strategy. The Wall Street Journal reports widespread disillusionment within the business community, while the Financial Times features experts who conclude that America has effectively lost the war it initiated. Trade unions echo this sentiment. Workers in steel, auto, and manufacturing industries admit tariffs not only failed to help but worsened their situations, driving up prices and triggering layoffs. Opinion polls further confirm the collapse of confidence. Public trust in the administration's economic policy has sunk to record lows. The tariff war has become synonymous with failure, a wound to both the economy and America's global standing. Even more troubling are the ripple effects. With debt levels at historic highs, inflation eroding household budgets, and millions of Americans struggling to afford basic necessities, public frustration is intensifying. All the while, Washington continues to pour billions into foreign conflicts, amplifying the perception that domestic concerns are being neglected. Allies too see the writing on the wall. Saudi Arabia and the UAE openly explore oil trade in yuan. African nations embrace Chinese investments. Latin America moves toward forming independent trade blocs without American involvement. For decades, the American market was the cornerstone of global profit. Today, more and more nations are preparing for a parallel system, one in which Washington plays only a secondary role. Ironically, it was the tariff war itself, launched to prove American strength, that accelerated this process of realignment. Political scientists now warn of a sobering new reality: the world has entered an age of multipolarity. The United States no longer holds the privilege of unilateral dominance. The White House faces a critical decision: adapt to the emerging order and cooperate, or cling desperately to the past and risk losing even the influence it still retains. One conclusion, however, is undeniable. The tariff war, once hailed as a symbol of American power, will be remembered in history as one of its most damaging geopolitical missteps, an event that weakened the nation's economy, fractured its alliances, and marked the visible decline of its unipolar era. And before you leave, make sure to like, subscribe, and follow Insight Global for more in-depth analysis of the forces reshaping our world.